Thank you, Gary. Now it's time to take a look at the news capturing headlines around the globe in our Arise News World Wrap. Amid tight security and braving cold rain, Pope Francis today visited one of Rio de Janeiro's poorest neighborhoods, the community of Varginha. His open-air car was mobbed by cheering crowds, beseeching him for blessings and hugs, although he was never in any danger. Later today, he will preside over a welcoming ceremony on Copacabana Beach for World Youth Day. And Vice President Joe Biden told Indian business leaders that commercial ties between their two countries should be strengthened and that trade should expand exponentially. Biden's remarks came the day after his meeting with his Indian counterpart, Mohammed Hamid Ansari, where the two discussed ways to boost trade and political and defense ties between the two allies. Meanwhile, strained relations between Japan and China intensified today after a Chinese military aircraft flew through international airspace over uninhabited East China Sea islands. Japan scrambled fighter jets in response to the move, which is seen as an indication of China's goal of maritime expansion. Tensions escalated last September when Japan bought 3 of the disputed islands from a private owner. And sunlight is coming to 3,500 residents of southern Norway who normally live in darkness from September to March of each year. Plans are underway to install giant mirrors to reflect sunlight down in Rjukan. The town is surrounded by high mountains which keep the sun's rays from reaching the valley floor. The German-made mirrors have a total surface area of 538 square feet. And that is our Arise News World Wrap. United States military involvement in Syria would likely cost billions of dollars and carry a range of risk for the forces involved, according to options listed in the letter by Congress by the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Arise News foreign policy contributor is going to join us in just a moment, but take a look at this story. Train, advise, and assist opposition forces in safe areas outside of Syria. That would require several hundred to several thousand American troops and cost $500 million a year. It would strengthen the opposition, but also might help extremist factions linked to al-Qaeda. Conduct limited air and missile strikes against Syrian forces and command centers. Hundreds of aircraft and ships operating in the Mediterranean would attack hundreds of targets inside Syria. That would cost billions of dollars and inflict significant damage on Syrian forces, but could not guarantee the regime's collapse and would probably cause civilian casualties. Establish a no-fly zone over all of Syria. That, too, would require hundreds of aircraft and cost up to $1 billion a month and might not accomplish much since the Syrian army relies mostly on ground-based artillery and missiles, not air power. Establish buffer zones inside Syria as safe havens for opposition fighters and civilians. That would require smaller no-fly zones, but also thousands of U.S. troops to defend the safe havens. Estimated costs more than $1 billion a month. Destroy or seize Syria's chemical weapons, a massive operation that would require a no-fly zone plus airstrikes plus thousands of American troops. Again, the estimated cost would be well over $1 billion a month. Now, Rise News foreign policy contributor is in Hampton, Virginia, and he's joining us from there today. That's Brian Palmer. Hey, Brian, always good to see you, my friend.
Hello, Debbie. How are you?
I'm doing fine. There's so much to talk about. Let's, of course, start with Syria. Beside the civil war that's been raging there for now 2 years, there is this growing crisis of refugees.
Right. Well, let's start with the violence. Bombing today in the suburbs of Damascus, killing 10 people, probably wounding about 63. That's nothing new, unfortunately. The UN reporting that more than 100,000 people have been killed in this conflict, and I think that's something that we have to keep in mind, particularly because when you have 100,000 killed, it means that wounded, injured, maimed people are an order of magnitude higher. 2 million refugees have left the country, going to countries like Jordan, one of Syria's neighbors, really destabilizing that country. But you have almost the same number displaced internally. So again, the United Nations saying that this is one of the worst refugee situations going on in the world today.
Indeed, and this huge problem with the refugees also serves to destabilize the region, particularly in countries that are accepting these refugees like Jordan, right?
I think that's a really big problem. We saw that with the Iraq War, when a huge percentage of the population fled that violence. But there's also the question of the general permeability of the borders, because you're not just getting refugees, you're getting people with guns who want to aid one side or another side. And I think that is a tremendous contributing factor to the instability in the region.
Indeed. Let's move on to our next topic, and that, of course, is Edward Snowden. Been in the news for a long time. We thought that he was going to be granted asylum and allowed to leave the airport there in Russia, but not yet, not so. What happened?
What happened? I think it depends upon who you believe. What his lawyer is saying, his lawyer in Russia is saying that one particular piece of paper wasn't filed. So all of the reports of him being given temporary asylum, that being a done deal, that does not seem to be the case. What seems to be the case is that Snowden is saying he plans to remain in Russia temporarily, which is quite a bit different from what he was saying before about moving on to South America.
Yeah, that's sort of a perplexing situation there. What could we expect to hear about this, the next step then for him?
Your guess is as good as mine, because I think he's probably pondering what the next step is. And I think that the U.S., I'm sure, is applying all kinds of different diplomatic pressure behind the scenes in order to get him back to face felony charges here. So I would predict continued unpredictability.
Indeed. All right. So let's move on to our last topic in the last couple of minutes that we have here. Brian, that's, of course, Egypt and the unrest there remains in the headlines. President Obama, the U.S., had pledged F-16 fighters to Egypt. That has been put on hold, right?
Right. Yes, it's been postponed. 4 F-16s supposed to be delivered to Egypt. But remember that the U.S. has never, ever cut off military aid to Egypt. So this could be a temporary thing. Even during the worst of some of the conflicts, with the initial revolution, we still kept that $1.3 billion worth of military aid flowing.
Indeed. And as I understand it, Brian, that General El-Sisi, I believe is how you say his name, calls for a nationwide protest against what he calls violence and terrorism, of course, referring to the protests that are mainly being backed by the Muslim Brotherhood. How does this further inflame the situation? Well,
I think you brought up probably the most important issue on the table today, Debbie, because the defense minister / leader of the coup, not coup, has called for rallies against violence and potential terrorism tomorrow in Egypt. So Friday, calling out people to protest nonviolently. The supporters of the Muslim Brotherhood, deposed President Morsi, are already out there. And the Muslim Brotherhood is being absolutely uncompromising about this. What they're saying is that Al-Sisi is calling for civil war. And we hope that it doesn't come to that. I don't think anyone is necessarily planning for that, but the rhetoric is certainly escalating. And we'll see what happens tomorrow. One hopes that cooler heads are going to prevail and that the leadership is actually furiously talking behind the scenes to keep things kind of tamped down.
Brian, very, very, very briefly, do you think, because it seems like the two sides have just come to an impenetrable impasse, that it will require the intervention of a mediator to get past this, this violence and unrest in Egypt?
Well, I would imagine that there are mediators working behind the scenes. I mean, the U.S.
And when I say that, I mean another country, someone from another country.
Well,
yeah.
Yes, I mean, the U.S. is operating behind the scenes. I'm sure of that. But I think, one of the issues is on this on the side of the people who wanted to depose Morsi, the pro-democracy, as they call them, forces. When you invite the military into a situation such as this, you kind of circumvent the democratic process, and that kind of throws everything into a real difficult spin.
Sure.
So I think now that, yes, we may have intense operation behind the scenes by other countries, other allies of Egypt, but fundamentally, this is something that Egyptians have to work out for themselves.
Yeah, and of course, President Obama said that in his last remarks on the subject. All right, Brian Palmer, always good to hear your analysis. Thank you so much. Safe travels to you.
Thank you, Debbie.
And you are watching Arise America.